Hi everyone, this is episode 269 of the Intercooler podcast with Dan Prosser and Andrew Frankel. And this week we're talking about actually one of my favourite topics because we're discussing Bentley, which means I can just wind you up and let you go, and I can just sit back and take an hour off. So off you go.
Right, good, excellent. Well, it all began...
No, I'll try to contribute something to this discussion.
Good.
But
I've been wanting to do this podcast since we've been doing podcasts.
So, yeah, why is that? And what does Bentley mean to you? I know you've done a bit of work for Bentley in the past. I know you've been quite close to Bentley at certain stages. But it has a particular significance for you, doesn't it? More than an Aston Martin or something?
It basically all comes down to my father, who was obsessed with vintage Bentleys.
Yeah.
So Bentleys of the 1920s, essentially. And he worked because he'd started with very little, and eventually was able to buy one of these things. And he had quite a lot of cars through his life, and some other Bentleys too. But this one car, which is still in the family, was his pride and joy. And he always said that, and he very nearly did lose everything in the 1970s, that they could take everything apart from, that car. We didn't take it too personally. But actually, when I first started going in it and eventually driving it and then eventually doing some quite interesting things in it, there was something about the integrity of its engineering which has always just resonated with me and I found fascinating. And the more I researched the brand, not sort of intentionally, but just absorbed content. I used to, as a kid, that's how sad I was. So they used to produce sort of digests of all the publications, all the magazines who've written stuff about Bentley, and you get this thing, and it used to come in a yellow sort of paper cover called, Bentleys of the 1920s, and then there would be, Auto Cars report from Le Mans in 1927, and the Motors report from Brooklands in 1920, and they collate all this stuff, and that was obviously, I think, the other thing which really, as the sort of young me, lit the fire was it wasn't just the cars, it was the people. The Bentley boys.
Yeah, of course.
These lunatics. Yeah. Many of whom I suspect I probably wouldn't have liked very much if I'd actually met them, because I think that they were probably about as unreconstructed a group of society as you could imagine. But they were all heroes, and they weren't heroes because they drove Bentleys really fast at places like Le Mans. They were all heroes because these were people who had seen frontline service in World War I. These were people who, many of whom had been terribly injured. There's a bloke called Bernard Rubin who won Le Mans in 1928. He was so badly injured, he didn't walk for 2 years.
Oh, blimey.
And, most of them...
Injured in the war?
In the war,
yeah.
Most of them, very few of them got injured in Bentleys. There was one, there was a bloke called Clive Dunphy who got killed in one, but that was after Bentley had stopped racing. But these guys, to them, racing a vintage Bentley at night, in the rain, at Le Mans, in the 1920s, with no headlights to speak of, that was kind of like reasonably exciting, but nothing. Compare that to frontline service on on the Somme or wherever.
Yeah, it's nothing.
It's nothing. So there was a genuine, because that word hero gets bandied about so much, doesn't it? With if anybody plays any sport to any level at all, they're a hero, and they've never have been to me. A hero is someone who is capable of performing genuinely heroic acts. And these guys all did. And so they were heroes, but they weren't heroes because they drove Bentleys. But then again, the way they drove Bentleys in this sort of press on regardless, never say die kind of way, I found enchanting as a kid. And there's a lot of me that still does. So it's as much about the people as the cars. And, and WO Bentley, who I still think is probably our most underrated automotive engineer, because his great thing, he was never first to anything. He just did what had already been done to a massively higher standard than had ever been done before. And, in the process, didn't just establish Bentley as a brand that is obviously, having changed ownership a few times, still around today, but he also, in motor racing terms, he put Britain on the map.
Yeah. So what in sort of global motorsport at the highest level, what did Britain have to shout about before Bentley?
Almost nothing. So Henry Seagrave, who went on to set the land speed record, before that in 1923, he won the French Grand Prix in a Sunbeam. That was like the most that anybody had ever done it in anything in a British car. But that was kind of it. And then Bentley comes along, and there's this new race in France, in this town called Le Mans, which starts in 1923. One Bentley enters. It's not Bentley's Bentley. It's a private person's entry. And Bentley thought the entire thing was insane and that nobody would finish it, and only went under sufferance at the very last minute, and then became completely captivated. And then in the races after that, well, they won in 24, didn't in 25 or 26, but then won from 27, 28, 29 and 30. By which stage, Bentley had secured for Britain its place on the motor racing map, which we have never relinquished. So it kind of started there to me. So for all sorts of reasons, for the road cars, for the racing cars, for the creator, for the drivers, but I think more than anything else, just for the engineering. There's a very famous story which I tell, but it's absolutely true because I've seen it. After the 1929 race, their workshop mechanic was a bloke called Nobby Clark. And he got the engine out of a Speed 6, which was, I guess, the car that had won it. And as they always did back then, as they do today, stripped it down to its component form, having done 24 hours of racing at Le Mans, flat out racing, measured everything, and then wrote his report, which in its entirety reads, "Nothing to report."
That's amazing.
There was no measurable wear on anything after 24 hours of racing. That is the level of engineering that I just found.
Things were just built strong, weren't they?
Well, I mean, a lot of it, and a lot of the WO Bentley's philosophy was because they didn't know enough about metallurgy, he tended to over-engineer everything so that come what may, it wouldn't break, because, you can build the fastest car in the world, but if it's not there at the finish, it's not coming anywhere. But also, he also thought that was the correct approach for his road cars, because he wanted, this was in an era where cars were developing at such a pace, when things which even, before the First World War, which had started less than 10 years before Bentley first went to Le Mans, people would not drive their road cars across Europe. Road cars were noisy, smelly, unreliable, probably quite dangerous contraptions for jollies.
Yeah.
But W.O. Bentley wanted people to get in his cars and drive them to the south of France and all around Italy and go everywhere in them. And to do that, you couldn't have them steaming at the side of the road. So they had to keep going. And they did. And I think that he instilled a level of engineering excellence, both in his cars and in those that his cars inspired, which lived on and did the whole British motor industry, a power of good for, well, a century to come.
What role did Motorsport? So Motorsport, from WO's point of view, was all about proving the strength and durability of the cars, I suppose.
Well, he kind of already knew that,
but he
wasn't proving it to himself. He was proving it. So to him, it was a marketing exercise.
But he wasn't an Enzo figure who just wanted to race.
No, absolutely not. No, he was a win on Sunday, sell on Monday guy.
Yeah,
that's why he raced.
Yeah,
and that is absolutely the case. So no, Bentley was, although Bentleys probably were racing pretty much at about the same time that customer cars were being delivered. Aston Martin were racing before they ever delivered a customer car. Bentley was not born as a racing manufacturer. His famous quote that a Bentley should be a good car, a fast car, the best in its class. Nowhere in there is it the fastest car.
No.
He was actually as interested and obsessed with refinement as he was with ultimate speed. It's also why he didn't build cars like Bugattis, which are very small and very light, Grand Prix machines. No, he raced his road cars. He produced the road car, and they were remarkably little different. If you could drive so Bentley at the moment, they have two blower Bentleys. One as a road car, one as a racing car. And yes, of course, there are differences absolutely everywhere between them. But essentially, they're the same car.
Yeah, fundamentally,
they're the same car. One is just a race-prepared version of the other. They're not. Bentley never produced a pure racing car. And again, that speaks to the desire to use racing as a tool for selling cars.
So from the road car point of view, what was Bentley's heyday?
So instinctively, I kind of want to say they never really had one, insofar as the company was never successful. I think it might have made a profit in 1 year. It might have made a profit in about 1928.
Yeah.
Because the early years were all about, the upfront investment required. The other thing which people should understand is that WO Bentley was a pretty terrible businessman. And he got sidelined so I think in 1926, when the company was about to go bust, he went to this legendary figure called Wolf Bonato, who was the son of a diamond millionaire, and said, help. And Bonato said, fine, I'll help. But you just kind of take a back seat. So I think he was the managing director. And then by the end, so the company finally went bust in 1931 when Bonato wouldn't support it anymore. He was the sort of manager of the race team. But that's really all he did.
Oh, really?
And he did a lot of the road car development, and he was often just sort of sent off around Europe in the latest product just to, possibly just to sort of keep him out of the way, but also because, he was, very good at developing cars, but he was not a businessman in any sense at all. So I think the heyday in terms of public perception was the very late 1920s and 1930. This is when, the racing was at its peak. So in 1929, they entered 4 cars for Le Mans, and they came first, second, third, and fifth. I mean, it was a complete walkover. The biggest challenge they had during that race was slowing the cars down, because the drivers were one of the drivers said, what do you want me to do? Get out and push the bloody thing. But that by winning the race as slowly as possible is what enabled them to beat the Works Mercedes team in 1930, which is generally regarded to be the greatest achievement in racing that they ever did. Because Mercedes turned up having based all their assumptions on what Bentley did in 1929, without realising that the cars weren't going anything like as fast. And so that enabled... And to be fair, I mean, it was a bit of a pile-on, because I think there were 4 or 5 Bentleys and 1 Mercedes. But then again, the Bentleys had 4.5-litre supercharged engines, or a naturally aspirated 6.5-litre engine. The Mercedes had a 7-litre engine and a supercharger. So on paper, the Mercedes was far more powerful, but they pushed it and pushed it and pushed it, and it broke, and Bentley won again, and whoop-de-dup. That is regarded as the crowning moment of the original Bentley company. But of course, by then, the Wall Street crash had come. Bentleys, they'd always struggled to sell them because they weren't cheap things. And nobody wanted these huge Leviathans anymore. And, the whole supercharged Bentley thing had been expensive and not been good for its reputation, because not one ever won a race. Most of them retired from the races that they went into. They then did a thing called the 4-litre, which wasn't even a Bentley engine, but it was like, we have to have a more economical car. So they got a company called Ricardo, and left the same Ricardo.
Is it?
Yep. That still works on the south coast. So Ricardo designed a 4-litre engine, which in itself was not a bad engine, but it shouldn't have been in a car that was designed for an 8-litre engine. So it couldn't pull the skin off a rice pudding, and that didn't help either. But mainly it was just the crash and the fact that by 1931, Bonato had got bored. It had cost him huge amounts of money just to keep it alive until then. And so he said, sorry guys, the receivers were called in, and that was that.
So what happened to Bentley then? Who came along and
a company called Napier came along. Now Napier were probably the only other British company which could say, we'd done significant stuff in motor racing. And WO Bentley was very excited about Napier, because Napier would have come along and would have enabled Bentley to carry on doing what Bentley was doing. Very much understood the racing, very much understood the sporting side of things, and all was good. And the deal was agreed, and everything else. And then at the last minute, a bid for the company came in from an anonymous source.
Yes.
And it was much bigger than anything that Napier had been prepared to pay. And Napier said, we're the best one in the world, we can't match this. And that anonymous company turned out to be a front for Rolls-Royce motor cars. And so Bentley in 1931 was bought by Rolls-Royce.
And so that's how the long union came to be.
That's exactly how the long union came to be. And, WO Bentley was pretty much put out to pasture almost immediately. Henry Royce was still alive. He died in 1933, I think. But the two of them didn't get along. I don't think that Royce was really even in that much favour of doing the deal, because his view was, what can Bentley do? What has Bentley done, which we couldn't do ourselves if we wanted to and haven't already done? But it did happen. But WO left the company pretty shortly after that. And then the era of what they call Rolls Bentleys began and continued until 1998.
It gets so complicated, and for some period of time, one of them's doing really well and the other one's struggling, and then it gets reversed.
Yeah, so in the 1930s, in the early years of the Rolls-Royce Bentleys, the cars, they were treated as separate brands, and the products were very, very different. So the 1930s Bentleys were known as the silent sports cars. They were built on adapted Rolls-Royce chassis. They had Rolls-Royce engines, but highly tuned Rolls-Royce engines. They came with much more sporting bodywork. And these Derby Bentleys, as they're known because they were built in Derby, with the original factory in London being in Cricklewood, they were really good cars. Really good cars. I mean, they didn't have the sort of blood and thunder of the vintage cars, which were amazing, epic occasions, but they were pretty much as advertised. They were very quiet, very refined, very reliable, very fast. They could do huge distances with very little effort. They were genuinely good cars. And it was only after the war when all the terms of reference had changed. And the money wasn't around. If Rolls-Royce was going to survive, the only way it was going to survive was by making a very standardized car, not putting, because in the past, what you did was you bought a chassis and an engine from a manufacturer, and you then sent it off to your own personal coach builder to put a body on it. Yeah. Well, that had basically all stopped, not entirely, but almost completely. And so Rolls-Royce produced this thing called the Mark VI after the war, which was on a standard pressed steel chassis body. And the Bentleys were just part of that. And they just became badge engineered cars.
So how long do we need to linger around the 40s, 50s, 60s?
Not long at all. Not long at all. I mean, so the Mark VI Bentley and the R-Type that followed it and the S-Types that followed them were all just Rolls-Royces with Bentley badges. The only exception was the original R-Type Continental, of which 200 and something were made in the 1950s. The last manual Bentley, one of the most beautiful cars that you could ever see. Incredibly valuable today. Bentley have one, and would do, in 1952, would do 120 miles an hour, which was pretty astonishing back then. I mean, possibly unprecedented. Possibly even a case to be made for it being the world's first true supercar. Don't know. Anyway, but then after, we can kind of skip through the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, because they were just, whatever Rolls-Royce was making, there would just be a Bentley equivalent. So, there would be Silver Clouds, which would be, S-types or S2s. These were the first cars which got the V8, but the V8 was Rolls-Royce's V8 in 1959. And really, people increasingly came to the conclusion that if they wanted a car built by Rolls-Royce, which was a Rolls-Royce, right down to literally the shape of its radiator grille, they'd probably prefer to have a Rolls-Royce.
Yeah.
And so it was only really the iconoclasts, the exceptionalists, who decided that, no, I don't want a Rolls-Royce, I can have a Bentley. But I mean, even to the fact that if you bought a Bentley, like a sort of T-type Bentley, a T-series Bentley in the 1960s or 1970s, and you looked at the handbook, it didn't even have Bentley on it. They didn't even bother changing the handbook. It was a Rolls-Royce handbook. Yeah. So they were the same car. And by the early 1980s, and I think we've skipped best part of half a century, but I don't think it's wrong to do that. Bentley production was 4% of overall Rolls-Royce production, and the cars were basically, the brand was basically moribund.
Yes, so that was the lowest point, was it?
That was the lowest point, yeah.
Ooh, blimey.
Yes. Until someone came along. Was it Ernest Hives? Maybe. Anyway, someone came along, and not as a joke, but just as a sort of interesting thing to do, said, look, we've got this Bentley brand. It's not doing anything for us anymore. We're not selling any more Rolls-Royces. We're certainly not selling any Bentleys. Why don't we and it's got this great heritage, which Rolls-Royce doesn't have, this great sort of fast car heritage. Why don't we just do, something interesting? And the good news is this thing called the turbocharger has come along. It's still, reasonably new technology, but we think that if you strap one of these to our 6 3/4 litre V8, something interesting might happen. And from that moment onwards, from the launch of the first Mulsanne Turbo, which wasn't much more than a Rolls-Royce Silver Spirit with a turbocharged engine. They hadn't done very much to the suspension or the brakes, so I've never driven one, but apparently it was really a bit of a sort of wallowy old thing. But it went. It did 140 miles an hour. And suddenly everybody went, wow. It's interesting, isn't it, that a brand can, and I think it informs us about brands that exist today, which, you and I might not think are in the best of health, about how long reputations can last and how eager people will be to return to those brands once they start producing cars that are worth buying again. We think today, don't we, about Alfa Romeo and Maserati we've talked about.
One great car, well aimed, well judged car can turn all around.
To the extent. So the Mulsanne Turbo came on. So the Mulsanne turned up in 1980, but that was Rolls-Royce. The Mulsanne Turbo in 1982. Spool forward 15 years to 1997, which in the context of what we've been talking about is not a long period of time. It had completely flipped. And now it was Rolls-Royce production that was 4% of
strange, isn't it?
Of cruise output.
God, you cannot rest on your laurels in this business.
No, you can't. But that was because suddenly, the Mulsanne Turbo took off and they went, oh, blimey. Okay, well, that was kind of our practice car. So we're going to do another one, which actually, we might actually think a little bit about how it goes around corners and stops and that sort of thing. And that was the Turbo R. And that was just going out as I came into motoring journalism at the end of the 1980s. And by that time, they were flying. And rightly so, because those cars were, I think the overused cliches, they were cathedrals on wheels. But they were very fast cathedrals on wheels. And they just sweated charm.
Yeah.
They were just wonderful things.
Okay, so by this point, there was something worth someone else buying and doing something with.
Yes.
How complicated does it get at the sort of around the turn of the century?
The short answer is it gets very complicated, but we don't need to overcomplicate it for the purposes of this podcast. But essentially what had happened was that Vickers, which now owned the company, so Rolls-Royce, we're going to spool back very briefly, I promise, to 1971. Rolls-Royce was developing, Rolls-Royce was a company that made aircraft engines, but it was developing this thing called the RB211. Which was the engine which went basically, it was designed for the jumbo jet. And it then went on to sit under the wings of, most Boeings for a generation to come. But the development costs of that engine, it was an engine that saved Rolls-Royce, the aero engine company, but only after having damn near killed it.
Yeah.
And the only way it could survive was to sell off the road car company. So that's where Rolls-Royce PLC, as is today, which makes the aircraft engines and the military stuff, and Rolls-Royce Motor Cars, which make the road cars, that's when they split. And to this day, Rolls-Royce, the aero engine company, holds the rights to the Rolls-Royce name and effectively leases that right to BMW. And BMW does not own Rolls-Royce. BMW owns the right to call a car a Rolls-Royce. So, which frankly is all you need, isn't it? If you're going to do a brand new car,
thing, isn't it?
So when the first Phantom came up, it wasn't like a sort of a developed Silver Seraph or anything. It was just a brand new car called the Rolls-Royce because it had bought the right to be able to do that. So Vickers was putting nothing into either company, and technology was advancing, and none of the big developments. There's this story about a Rolls-Royce Bentley engineer ringing up Bosch at the end of the 1990s and going, we'd like some of your fuel injection, please, or your engine management. And Bosch going, well, how many do you want? And he went, I could probably run to 1,000. And the bloke from Bosch literally laughed.
Yeah.
And then the same bloke rang back at the same time the following year and asked for exactly the same thing and said, by the way, we're now owned by Volkswagen. And the bloke went, how many do you want? When do you want them? So that was the situation that the companies found themselves in. Rolls-Royce was, almost a dead duck. Bentley was not, had obviously been massively rejuvenated, but was living on its laurels and was not capable of realising anything like its full potential. And so Vickers put the companies up for sale. And it depends who you believe. The people from Volkswagen will tell you that they only ever wanted Bentley. I personally struggle to believe that. I think they wanted both. But the aero engine company wanted the car company to go to BMW because the aero engine company and BMW had a long history together. And it all got, very litigious, and there was bids and counter bids and a little bit. Anyway, the long and the short of it is that the companies got split. And Volkswagen got Bentley the company, not just the name. They got the company, they got the factory, they got everything, whereas BMW just got the right to call a car a Rolls-Royce, and obviously paid a proportionally much smaller sum for that right. At Crewe at the time, so Crewe was a factory that had been built in 1938 to make aero engines for the war. The legendary Merlin engine that... you could find in everything from a Spitfire to a Mosquito to a Lancaster bomber to a Mustang, an American Mustang. They all had Merlins, but their Merlins were built in America. But anyway, that's what the factory had been built to do. And then production continued at Crewe right up until then. And then Rolls-Royce disappeared off in 1998. And there were people around the factory who literally wore black armbands the day that Rolls-Royce left the company.
So... I just wanted to chip in here. So Dr. Uli Eichhorn, one of our writers.
Yes.
So he was engineering chief at Bentley.
He became engineering chief at Bentley in 2003, so 5 years after the takeover.
So he was there when the takeover was happening, I think?
No, he wasn't.
Okay.
No.
All right. So okay, fine. But he knows what it was like.
Oh, he knows all about it, yeah.
So he wrote a piece for us a couple of years ago. I just want to read an excerpt. He says, for our staff, many of whom still thought they worked at Royce's.
Yes.
We had a program called Becoming Bentley. While some had a conceptual problem with there being so many Germans in the management, it was quickly realised that we were car guys and in our hearts really did want only the best for the product and Bentley. In many ways, many of us were seen as more approachable than some of our predecessors. At the end of Becoming Bentley, a not entirely sober colleague from the shop floor told me on the occasion of his 40th anniversary party at the company, "You should have bought us 20 years ago."
Absolutely right.
So it's interesting, isn't there? There really was some resistance. And frankly, I mean, the people working up in Crewe must have been so proud to be British. And then this German giant comes along and buys you out and parachutes a load of Germans into the management.
Yes.
There's going to be resistance to that.
The irony being, all this in a factory that was built to bomb Germany.
Yeah. There's going to be a lot of resistance to that.
Yeah. And there was. But I think what Uli says is absolutely correct. And it didn't take long. So the first thing that Rolls-Royce did, forget that was a Freudian slip. The first thing that Volkswagen did was Bentley had produced the Arnage, their replacement for the Mulsanne and the Mulsanne Turbo. But by then, they had done a deal with BMW. And so Rolls-Royce, the Rolls-Royce Seraph got a V12 BMW engine, and the Arnage got a V8, BMW 4.4 litre V8. With twin turbo installation done by Cosworth, and latterly it became known as the Arnage Green Label. And I drove them when they were new, and they were kind of okay, but they just didn't feel like Bentleys because Bentleys had massive 6 3/4 litre V8 engines in them with turbochargers on them. And the first thing that Volkswagen did was saying, well, that big old V8 we don't really use anymore. We're going to stick it in the Arnage. And I think everybody went, what? Volkswagen spent more money engineering the Arnage to take that V8 than Vickers spent engineering the Arnage.
Yeah.
So more money was spent on a program just to put an old engine back in that car than the entire car had cost to make in the first place. And then I think people realised that these guys were serious.
Yeah.
And that they weren't just going to become, badge engineered Volkswagens. And then, of course, it all fed on from there. The investment that went into the factory, totally transforming it. And then, guess what, boys? We're going back to Le Mans, which is just, around the pride. I mean, I was there because, I was commissioned to write a book about the whole thing. So I know of which I speak. I can remember talking to a bloke called Joachim Rothenpieler, who I think was their finance director or their production director, who was a fairly ferocious German chap. And I asked him, when you first got here, what were your first impressions? And he went, shut the place down.
Really?
It was that bad. And then the investment poured in. The factory got transformed. They went back to Lemoore. And then this thing called the Continental GT turned up.
So, I mean, the VW takeover was phenomenal, ultimately, for Bentley. And it allowed Bentley to do things it couldn't otherwise do. And just as a case in point, the Continental GT arrived. And so the year before the car arrived, Bentley built 792 cars.
Sounds about right.
The year after, 7,686 cars.
Yes.
A tenfold increase.
Yes. Just
because one car arrived, the Continental GT. And then Bentley produced 10,000 cars in a year for the first time in 2006. And then it did drop down quite significantly to under 4,000 a couple of years later.
Yeah, but that was after the great crash of 2007/8.
And that's right, and it's risen again, and it's been fairly stable at 10, 11, 12,000 ever since.
Yeah, so Bentley actually did in 2006. They got so overwhelmed with demand, and this was after the Flying Spur had been introduced, that they actually built some Flying Spurs in a Volkswagen factory in Dresden.
Yeah,
and they're the only Bentleys that have ever been built outside the UK. I think it was all left-hand drive production. So if you buy one in the UK, it's probably unlikely to have been built in Dresden. But if we just focus on the Continental GT very briefly, here was a car which had 550 horsepower. It was a genuine. They claimed it would do 198 miles an hour. It wouldn't. It was a 200 mile an hour car all day long, and that was very rapidly proved. It was full of the latest tech. It looked very cool. And the staggering thing about it was, despite being so far and away the fastest, most powerful thing that Bentley had ever produced, it was also the cheapest.
Oh, really?
It cost like 2/3 the price of an Arnage R or a Continental T or anything like that. So it was one of those. It wasn't just transformational for Bentley. It was kind of transformational for the entire sector, because there really wasn't anything else like that out there. Aston Martin were still. So the DB9 was just starting to come on stream, but hadn't really arrived. You could go and buy a big Mercedes-Benz, but that wouldn't have had the cachet. And suddenly this was a car, a Bentley, that you didn't buy for its oldie worldy quaintness and charm. You bought it because it was absolutely the best thing out there.
And a lot of people bought it. And the really clever thing about the Continental GT was that, platform sharing made that car possible with a VW platform. Even today, it shares a platform with VW Group stuff, Porsches.
Yes.
But the stuff that really mattered, the stuff that gave a car personality and individuality, was bespoke to Bentley. So the interior, the way it looked, the engine, W12.
Okay, that was, a Volkswagen stroke Audi engine. And it did go into some Audi A8s, and I think it also went into the Phaeton. But it became synonymous with Bentley.
It did, didn't it?
And it was built at Bentley. And all its sort of latter engineering was done at Bentley. And yeah, you're absolutely right. And when people say platform sharing, the platform you're talking about is the D1 platform, which also underpinned the Volkswagen Phaeton. But it's not like it was a Phaeton in party gear.
No.
At all. There were some very fundamental engineering changes. The wheelbase, there wasn't a single dimension in common with them. That platform provided the sort of the raw material, if you like, which was then melded into this
It was still adaptable enough. But if you're going to do platform sharing, particularly if you are the premium mark, that platform sharing has to be done in a very nuanced way.
Yes.
That allows you to build a car that still feels authentic to your own mark. You can't just get away with rebadging a VW, can you? It just doesn't work.
No, you really can't. And it has to, more than anything else, if it doesn't live up to the expectations of the standard of that mark, and not just the mark as is now, but the history of that mark. And I think the most impressive thing, if you go and drive we know someone, don't we, who's got a 15-year-old Continental GT.
Yeah.
And okay, it's a lovely car and it's very low miles, but I've sat in it. It just feels like it's a new car. And it is built with that same sense of engineering integrity that's found upon which the marque was founded by WO Bentley in the 1920s. Uli Icon used to sit at his desk, and behind it was a portrait of WO. So every time he walked into his office, he was reminded what he was there of the standard that was required.
So the Continental GT, absolutely transformative for Bentley and the Flying Spur, and other models that came along, Bentayga, which we'll come on to in a moment. And so just to bring us up to date, 2024 was Bentley's 6th successive year of profitability, 373 million euros in operating profit last year on 2.6 billion revenue. Now that, I guess, seems strong, but that's half 2022's profit. So it's come down a long way in a couple of years.
Yes.
Which is going to ring alarm bells over in Crewe, isn't it? The profit margin last year was 14.1%, which is very good for the car industry.
14.1% is massively impressive, yes.
Yeah, and in March, Bentley began working on its battery electric vehicle production line, which tells us exactly what's coming down the tracks. Bentley's first EV in 2027. I want to come on to the Bentayga Speed because you've been driving it. You can talk about it now.
Yes.
Don't worry, I've checked.
Oh, good. Oh, excellent. Okay, yes.
But I want to talk about the Bentayga because it's a 10-year-old car now.
That's the thing.
And it's been updated a couple of times, isn't it?
Once, really.
Okay, yeah.
It's had one big refresh, which frankly it needed because the original one just physically, just to look at, was not doing.
So has the Bentayga done well for them? It looks like it's done around 5,000, maybe 6,000 units a year. The Range Rover does 75,000.
Yeah. I'm not aware of the actual numbers. I think the perception is that the Bentayga has done well for them. But I think it is only natural that with a car that has been in the marketplace for that long, that it's starting to feel the heat from the competition. And so the Bentayga Speed, which I've just been driving, is the replacement for the old W12 Bentayga Speed. It's a better car than that. And you drive it, and I've said in the piece that I've written, which will be on the website and app now, that I'm always two things. Or every time I drive a Bentayga, I'm reminded of two things. One is how much better than I think they're going to be. They tend to be, and then how much more I prefer the other stuff Bentley makes.
No.
I just prefer. I mean, I love a Continental GT and a Flying Spur. I think are outstanding cars. I think a Bentayga is impressive for the staying power that it has exhibited. In the fact that it is still competitive, it is still within the class that it sits, it's still an entirely credible proposition. But it's not an outstanding car. And I'm not sure it ever was an outstanding car. I think the only time it might have qualified for that would have been I can't remember when the refresh was. It would have been about 2018, 2019.
20, I think.
Okay, so when they just completely redid the look of the thing. And that would probably have been before its latest competition came along. Then I think it was a pretty competitive car. But today its job is to kind of like see it through, isn't it?
And it was never going to do Range Rover volumes because there isn't the capacity at Crewe.
No,
anything like it.
And I think to an extent that they wouldn't want to. I think the moment those sort of blue chip brands start to become or want to become volume manufacturers, things tend to wheels tend to fall off buses quite quickly. But what can I say? 10 years on, I mean, I can't imagine that's how it was always planned. Before we came on air, you were talking to me and said, so, what happened? How did the Bentayga get to be 10 years old? Why hasn't there been another one? And the simple, honest answer to your question is I don't know. But I can guess, and my guess is that the Bentayga replacement was always intended to be an electric car. And Bentley, as we know, had gone on the record to say that it would become an all-electric brand by 2030. It then had to, like so many other manufacturers, roll back on that. And now it is at some stage in the 2030s. And I think that programs just got pushed back. And I suspect the Bentayga replacement, and I absolutely don't know this, is one of the things that got pushed back. And they took the view better to sell a car that we know we can sell, even if it's not the latest, greatest thing, even if it might not sell in quite the sort of quantities that it once did, than put an EV on sale, which we strongly suspect would really struggle in the marketplace for all the reasons that we've talked about on previous podcasts.
So as you say, the Continental GT and Flying Spur are cracking cars.
Brilliant.
I mean, is the Bentayga Speed sort of similarly good? I mean, it now has a V8, a heavily hybridized powertrain, I think.
The Bentayga Speed?
Yeah.
No, it's no hybrid.
Oh.
No, that's the thing. So that was the first question I asked.
Yeah.
Why no hybrid? And there are some engineering issues with incorporating, because obviously it sits on a different platform to the Spur and the GT. There are some engineering issues incorporating it. They did say that it would become an extremely heavy car with it. It would obviously compromise its practicality in terms of boot space and that sort of thing, but it does that in the other ones as well. My sense is, apart from anything else, they're going to have to do a hybrid Bentayga. I mean, they've done one in the past with a V6 engine, but that's old tech, and that we're not going to see that again. I think they're going to have to put the whole hybrid powertrain, the one that's currently in the Flying Spur and the Continental GT, into the Bentayga in the not too distant future, because as we know, we get to 2030 and the rules all change, and pure ICE cars, which it is, are going to be persona non grata. So I think they will have to do it. I am sure that at the same time, I'm sure, I would be amazed if at the same time they didn't give it such a comprehensive facelift as to essentially say it's a new car. So I think that although it will probably technically exist on the same platform that it's been on for the last 10 years, I think it will be so completely different as to, it certainly in the marketplace, be regarded to be a new car.
So how is the Bentayga Speed then? Is it a good thing?
It is good, but it's not great.
They're having a proper crack at the DBX 707 with that car, aren't they?
Well, are they? A DBX 707 is over 700 horsepower. Okay, it's 650. I mean, it's really fast. It's got a very efficient launch control mode on it. It'll get to 60.
I think it's got drift mode, isn't it?
Well, yeah. If you buy the carbon ceramic brakes,
right,
it comes with a drift mode.
Good.
Which I tried to test out on a bit of gravel. Yeah. But it was quite a narrow bit of gravel, and I don't know if you spotted it, but Bentaygas are quite big cars.
Yes.
So it wasn't like you were sort of drifting it around on the lock stops. But it was for a whatever it is, a 2.6 ton car. It was quite playful. But and good fun and terrific, and great that they're trying to think of ways to keep some youth in that car. But honestly, I mean, who's actually going to go drifting their Bentaygas anyway? But I mean, it's really fast. If you spend £7,700 on the full Akrapovic exhaust system, which is titanium, it sounds amazing. Yeah, terrific. But
so the engine's the V8. Because the W12 is gone.
So the engine is the same V8 it's the same V8 that they use in the Spur and the Continental GT, but without the hybrid. The reason they've been able to use it is the W12 was never highly tuned. 6-litre engine, it never had more than 700 horsepower. Maybe there was one version which had 720, but in terms of specific outputs, that's playing at it.
Particularly with a couple of turbos on it.
Yeah, particularly with a couple of turbos on it. And I think that's to do with thermal management, because it's such an incredibly compact engine, that W12. I think if you put too much oomph through it, I think it just gets quite hot. With the V8, it's easy to get more power out of a 4-litre V8 than they got out of a 6-litre W12 in the previous Bentayga Speed. So that's what they've done. I think power's only gone up from like sort of 626 to 641 horsepower, and it's actually, you'd think, wow, it's only got 8 cylinders and 4 litres instead of 6, it's going to be much lighter. It's only about 30 kilos. But maybe weight doesn't matter too much about this sort of thing. And it's got slightly less torque, but the 0 to 60 figure has come down from like 3.8 to 3.4 seconds. And and it's fine. I sound like I'm damning with faint praise, and I guess I don't seek to damn the car, because I enjoyed it, I liked it. I would say it is still a good car. But when you look at it, particularly look at its interior, it does need refreshing.
So the chief over at Bentley now is Frank Stefan Walliser.
Yes.
He's been in the post coming up to a year,
I guess.
Is his influence starting to be felt, do you think?
Not that you would notice, but I think it would be unreasonable. I think it would be unrealistic to expect his influence to be noticed in this period of time, particularly given that his predecessor was Adrian Hallmark. who's now camped out at Aston Martin. I can't imagine. I know Adrian very well. I know Frank. I've spoken to him quite a few times. I think that they are men of similar mindsets. They're both absolute dyed-in-the-wool car guys, and both very clear thinking. I don't think it's going to be like Frank walks in there and goes, "Oh my God, what is this?" and decide to, completely overturn everything. I think he would have gone in there, looked at it, and went, "Pretty good, but there's more we can do."
Yeah.
Which is I think what he's doing. So no, the big thing is going to be the EV.
Well, that's right. We can come on to that in a moment, but I mean, profits have halved in 2 years.
Yes,
they're still making good profit, but they have halved. The Continental GT, the Flying Spur, really good cars, as we've said. The Bentayga is still very credible. What's happened though?
Well, okay, so I think what had happened was, the Continental GT, so the current version of that had come out in 2018, and the Flying Spur, I think, in 2019. And so by 2024, these are very mature products in the marketplace. And I think we know, don't we, that however good, this is Adrian Hallmark's big thing about Aston Martin at the moment, that however good the product are, you've still got to provide someone with a reason to get a new one.
Yeah.
Because if you've got a DB11 and 3 years in or 18 months in, or whenever you're kind of thinking about, well, I've really enjoyed that, had that, but time to get something else. And what can they offer you? The same car. You're not going to buy it. And I think that is probably where Bentley was in sort of 23, 24, with some quite mature product. But then, of course, what those figures don't reflect is how things have fared since the hybrids have come in. And the hybrids are both in terms of the financial proposition, from a sort of tax point of view, but also from a dynamic proposition point of view, they are pretty game changing. They make both cars, but I think the Continental GT in particular, pretty wonderful, because as I've said before, it's not so much the extra weight as where that weight is. And for the first time, you've actually got a proper balanced sports coupe. And so I would myself want to see what effect that those cars had had. And my understanding, having just spent a few days with Bentley, is that those cars are doing really well. In the meantime, however, you also have to reflect upon the global situation. Matters beyond Bentley's control, particularly China. So there was somebody at Bentley who told me while I was in America, and I won't mention his name just in case he shouldn't have told me, that their sales in China are down 40%. But the thing is, they're quite pleased with that because they think, if that sounds bad for us, see what the others are doing.
Yeah.
So again, that reflects entirely upon the state of the Chinese economy and not at all about the state of Bentley's products. So there are all sorts of reasons for these things. You mentioned earlier that in 2008, Bentley production more than halved. It wasn't because they suddenly started producing bad cars that nobody wanted. In 1931, when Bentley went bust, 80% of the reason for that had nothing to do with Bentley.
Yeah.
The Wall Street crash.
Yeah.
So I think that we are, and I think that, at the moment, in fact, I know that at the moment they are very nervous about tariffs, understandably so. They're quite optimistic because obviously if the 10% comes in and it hasn't come in yet, and they don't know when it's going to come. Imagine you're a product planner.
You just can't.
How do you do it? How do you go, okay, we're going to put this car on sale in that place at this price? How do you know?
Yeah.
So I think, understandably, in those sorts of situations, the instinct must be, well, we better do nothing because we just don't know what we're dealing with. So better not do it at all. So I think there are all sorts of reasons for it. But, there's no question at all that all its cars are, mature is the polite word, but getting old. We won't see anything genuinely new for the rest of this year or in 26, although they will show us the EV in 26, but it won't be on sale until 27. And then I imagine things will come along quite quickly after that.
So do we know what the EV is? Is it a Bentayga replacement? Is it a big SUV thing?
It's not a Bentayga replacement, and it's not a big SUV. It will be, I think it will be, they describe it as an urban SUV.
Oh, blimey.
Yes. So I
like
think,
a RAV4?
No, not like a RAV4. I think it will be a bit smaller than a Bentayga. Small enough to be size-wise, if not positioning, a class down. So more, probably bigger than a Macan.
Range Rover Sport.
Yeah, Range Rover Sport. I think so. Exactly. I think that's probably the best. I mean, again, I don't know because they're not saying anything about it. But talking to the engineering boss, who I mentioned earlier, Dr. Matthias Raab, he says the brief for that car is that it needs to be the best Bentley there has been.
Oh.
Not the best Bentley for now. Not the best EV in its class. The best Bentley, full stop.
Okay.
That is, if they deliver it, well played.
Yeah.
But it is writing quite a big check that car is going to have to cash.
2 questions before we wrap up this episode.
Yeah.
Does Bentley need a bigger, more luxurious saloon than a flying spur?
I think absolutely it
and
does.
Is that likely to happen?
I have asked the question sporadically over the years.
Yeah.
And you always get a knowing look.
Yeah. Okay.
To me, I think they'd be nuts not to do a new Mulsanne. Because if you think about the advantages and the disadvantage of electric powertrains.
Yeah.
Well, the weight is a disadvantage, but if it's a Mulsanne replacement, who cares? No one bought a Mulsanne because it was light. What a Mulsanne needs to be is to have a huge amount of power and to be very quiet. Well, what do you do? But the disadvantage is the range. Well, the Mulsanne, nobody would use their Mulsanne as an everyday car. It is an occasion car, so the range becomes less important. And at the moment, they have abandoned that territory to Rolls-Royce. And Rolls-Royce they've got the field to themselves and are making hay on it. Why wouldn't you want a slice of that action? To me, and again, I'm not a product planner, I don't work for Bentley, but to me it's a no-brainer. I think that they should do it. I think that they will do it. There's a bit of me which thinks they have to do it.
But also, there's a halo effect, isn't there? And it can be a very, very bespoke thing, beautifully finished inside and out.
Showcasing all the talents.
Yeah.
Yes.
Actually, that's a good point. One thing I did want to mention is even in this platform sharing age, when you go to Crewe and look around the factory, it's not like they're bussing in fully formed Volkswagens, taking the badge off and sticking some Bentley wings on it.
Far from it.
There's a lot of there's a lot of craftsmanship still going on there. Rows and rows of mostly women, I think, on sewing machines, sewing leather.
Yes.
Lots of people working with beautiful wood veneers and rejecting things for the slightest blemish.
So when I went to Flying Spares, which is this company that deals with scrapped or soon to be scrapped or possibly revived Rolls-Royce and Bentleys from years gone by, they get a lot of their stuff that is rejected from Bentley. Things like, I saw a load of bumpers, and I said to the bloke, "What are they all doing there?" And he said, the Bentley don't want them. They don't meet their quality control standards. I said, "What's wrong with them?" He said, "We've had a look at them. We can't see anything at all. They're perfect."
That's great.
So yeah.
The level, the quality, the attention to detail, the craftsmanship is still really, really high.
Bentley say that without going to, obviously they have their Mulliner department, which is their personal commissioning department, which will do anything from build you a car to stitch your kids' initials in your headrest. They say before you even go to Mulliner, and most Bentleys do tend to have a bit of Mulliner in them, there are 46 billion configurations that you could choose for your Bentley. Just on the sort of standard stuff that they do.
Probably enough, isn't it?
Yeah.
So final question then. Where's the racing program, today's racing program, and does it matter?
So in order, nowhere and yes.
Interesting.
So again, I asked the big man this exact question, and I put it to him because we said on one of our Le Mans podcasts, didn't we? I mean, I think you said to me, "Who's not there?" And I just went, "Bentley."
Yeah.
And so I said to him, "Look, everybody's piling in. All your rivals are in there. Bentley is apparently this great racing mark. Why aren't you doing it?" And the answer was, "I understand what you say. I know why you're saying it. I'm not even saying you're wrong, but we have more important things to be doing right now. We are putting all our efforts into our road cars to make them as good as we possibly can. And although Bentley would love to go racing again, there are," and the precise quote was, "no plans. So don't hold your breath."
Yeah.
Then again, I guess these days, I imagine that if they were going to go racing again, they go to Le Mans. And these days, it's an awful lot quicker and easier to do it now than it used to be. So they could probably take the decision today, certainly be on the grid in 2028, maybe even 27.
Yeah. And Valliser is a big racing guy.
Yes.
He's not going to do it just for fun. He's pragmatic and sensible enough. But, yeah, under his stewardship, you can see it happening, can't you?
I do hope so. Because I think you can only... I mean, they had a successful GT3 program.
Yeah.
But it wasn't famous. They've done some really interesting things like Pike's Peak, but these are all sort of on the niches of motorsport. They last won Le Mans. Well, they won Le Mans in 2003. Previous to that, it was 1930. So you could say that in the last, whatever it is, 95 years, they've won Le Mans once, and that was 22 years ago. And that if Bentley wishes to maintain its credibility as a genuinely sporting British marque, it should be putting at least some of its money where its mouth is. And I absolutely think that they should. But then again, I would. Yeah,
I know. It's easy to sit here and say that, isn't it?
Indeed.
All right. Well, that's Bentley. We'll wrap that one up there. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And I will remind you all that you should check out the Intercooler app and website. You should become a subscriber, because you can now listen to this podcast totally ad-free if you're a subscriber. You can listen to our midweek show, Ask the Intercooler. That's only for subscribers. That's where we answer your questions. You can also get all of our articles, our multi-award-winning articles, totally ad-free as audio podcasts. So you can listen if you don't have time to read. Thank you ever so much for checking out the Intercooler. I'll put a link in the description, or you can just head to the-intercooler.com and use coupon code POD20 to get a 20% discount on your first year if you take out an annual sub. There's a link in the description. Please go and do that. And in return, we'll be back again next week.
See you then.